G'day, my name's Chris Purnell. I'm the Wetland Bird Program Manager here at BirdLife Australia. I'm not here. This is my home in Melbourne, so welcome. And welcome to Birding from Home, episode 10. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of this area, the Wurundjeri people, and paying respects to their leaders past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to acknowledge that Aboriginal sovereignty was never ceded. Now, apologies for last week, a bit embarrassing. We couldn't get Facebook Live happening, but I've had stern words to Mark Zuckerberg and Bill Gates, and they've promised to pull their fingers out and it won't happen again. But anyway, here we are. We made it. We're going to talk about the floating roost trial and how what we're doing in Australia and Korea, trialling this innovative new project, is trying to conserve shorebirds throughout the flyway. So today we'll talk a little bit about mud, we'll talk about the tide, we'll talk about shorebirds, and we're going to focus on this very important part of shorebird ecology, which is roosting, which essentially is birds trying to conserve energy when they're not flying, and as this title suggests, they're rushing to relax. So if you get an idea of shorebird ecology, you know that their whole lifestyle is dictated by the tides rather than day and night. So when the tide's down, they can be out feeding across all the mudflat with thousands of other birds. But as the tide rises, it starts to cover that mudflat. And they get closer and closer to the shore until there's no mudflat left at all, and then thousands of birds often will be sitting up there condensed in a flock, and they'll rest it out, waiting for that tide to recede again so that they can once again feed out on that intertidal area. But what if, instead of being pushed up and having a safe place to sit and rest, like a sand spit or a rocky reef, or even just a beachy coastline, somebody had built buildings, walls, dikes on that area and precluded the tide from coming up. So the tide would push all those birds up until the tide met a wall and force the birds to fly and find another roost. And that's the problem we're trying to tackle. In many cases throughout the flyway, coastal development has reduced the amount of high tide roosts. So what can birds do in this scenario? They either fly or, as you probably guessed by the title of this talk, they can float. And here we have quite a unique natural floating roost, which is a redneck stint floating on a bit of weed. And this doesn't happen very often in the natural world, but gives us an idea of how much these birds like to hang out and need to rest while they're not feeding. So this redneck stint has been feeding throughout the tide cycle until the tide pushes right up and there is no more feeding habitat to be utilised, and then has sought somewhere to roost, in this case on a bit of floating eelgrass. And why do these birds need so much energy? Well, just as a quick background to their ecology, shorebirds, migratory shorebirds in particular, need to gain an enormous amount of energy so they can metabolise it on the wing, because they're flying round trips of 25,000 kilometres in some cases to their breeding grounds in Siberia, Mongolia and Alaska. Even that redneck stint, which is only the size of a Mars bar, flies all the way from Tasmania, southern Victoria, all the way up to Siberia to breed. And along the way, they need to be feeding and fueling themselves, and when they're not feeding, they need to be resting. So here we have a great diagram from our colleague and friend Millie Formby, and if you want to see more of Millie's stuff and learn a bit more about shorebirds, I encourage you to go and drop by wingthreads.com. But where can these birds refuel? So around Australian coastlines, while they're here in our spring and summer, they can spread out across the large coastline, but as they move north and they get up to that East Asian area, where the coastline's more north-south, there are fewer options, except for this large embayment that we know as the Yellow Sea. But the Yellow Sea also shares its coastline with some very highly populated countries, that being China, Korea, Republic of Korea and North Korea. And becomes a real pinch point where all these birds, 5 million birds who use this flyway, up to 40% of them use this area, the Yellow Sea, to refuel before moving on to their breeding grounds. So it's a critical pinch point and highly relied upon by migratory shorebirds. Many of the huge declines that we're seeing in these species, up to 10% in 8 years, these species are declining by. We see higher declines in species that are more heavily reliant on the Yellow Sea. So species like the eastern curlew, the bar-tailed godwit, the curlew sandpiper and the great knot are declining at a higher rate than species that populations have a lower proportion which depend on the Yellow Sea area. These species, up to 90% of their whole population, go through this pinch point. So it's been recognised by Australia and other range states within this flyway that we need to do our best to conserve the Yellow Sea. So the Australian government and NGOs like BirdLife Australia, BirdLife International, Birds Korea, the East Asian Australasian Flyway Network have been working together to have a joint approach to saving habitat throughout the flyway. So we had a great opportunity as BirdLife Australia. We've been trying to conserve habitat and work with government around Australia to preserve our habitats, but without preserving them throughout the chain of habitats in the flyway, it's piecemeal work. We can't expect to save the species if we're just focusing on our borders. So we had this unique opportunity with funding from Woodside Energy to go across to Korea and collaborate with the Koreans on work to conserve shorebird habitat in one of their most important staging areas that remains, and that's the Kum estuary. So let's have a look at the Kum. So the Kum is a really important stepping stone to the breeding grounds. It's part, as you can see, is the Yellow Sea, and the Yellow Sea as a whole has immense tidal flat extent, although it has declined by up to 80% in the last 60 years due to coastal development and damming of major rivers. One area which hasn't had such drastic declines is Seocheon County, which we can see here on the northern banks of the Kum estuary, spelt Geum, the Kum estuary. And the Kum Estuary Shorebird Conservation Project, which is funded by Woodside International, and we work with BirdLife International, is focused on this area. And as you can see, there still remains immense mudflats. And it's thought that up over a 40-day period, when several species are migrating north through this area, there's up to 170,000 birds which use the coastal mudflats of the Kum estuary and neighbouring Junghung coast in Seocheon County. So we had the opportunity to work with the county, local researchers and local government to come up with some ideas as to how we might collaborate, share conservation intervention practices and come out with best results for these shorebirds which are using these sites at certain times of year. These sites are obviously very important for shorebirds, but also for humans. So Seocheon County has taken very brave steps to conserve their coastline. They're conserving their natural heritage, but they're also conserving their cultural heritage. This has hundreds of years of fishing history, and people still in these areas harvest the coast using traditional methods. So Seocheon County has been very progressive in, rather than taking the easy step of developing and getting a quick buck through industry, they've been brave and said, no, we're going to attempt to create an economy that's based on cultural tourism and ecotourism. And they're also, off the back of that, going for a World Heritage listing, which BirdLife is having a hand in. Just to the south of this area, we have one of the most heavily altered systems in the Yellow Sea, and the infamous Saemangeum. So you might have heard about this. This was the most important site for shorebirds in the Republic of Korea, and certainly one of the most important sites in the whole Yellow Sea. This huge double estuary, there's two rivers which came out into the Yellow Sea here, depositing enormous amounts of sediment, create these vast mudflats that were relied upon by up to 240,000 shorebirds each year, and huge percentages of very threatened species, including great knot. However, through the late 90s and early 2000s, this huge seawall, which you can see over on the far right there, was commenced, and by 2006 was closed. Now, this seawall prevented the tide from coming in and covering those mudflats intermittently. So it essentially dried the mudflats out and killed everything that lived within them, and thus everything which survived from those invertebrates which lived within the mudflats, including shorebirds. So when 240,000 shorebirds came the next year after 2006 and relied upon this site to find refueling stations, they were sorely disappointed. And we saw the repercussions throughout the flyway. Fewer birds turned up on our shores, in particular counts in northwestern Australia, detected declines of up to 21% in great knot returning to Australia that year. And that can be a direct effect that was linked to the closing of this seawall. So not only was it precluding the tide, but you can see that there's been extensive building actually on the mudflat. You can see up there on that top right, of the 2016 image. That's Gunsan Port, and just down to the bottom of that is an American Army base. So we focused our attention just to the north, where some of the birds which did survive are essentially environmental refugees, and they moved north to Kum Estuary and the Junghang coast in Seocheon County. And this actually increased the amount of birds relying on that area. So one of the few places in the flyway which had an increase in shorebirds. So all the more important to protect and conserve and maximise its productivity. So what could we do? We couldn't do much as an international NGO to have long-term effects and be there on the ground and understand the complete geopolitics of the area. But we thought we can work with the government and what runs can we get on the board relatively quickly. We did a very quick, rough and ready situation analysis to see where the opportunities were and where the threats were. And what we found was one of the major limiting factors for shorebird success stemming out of the Kum Estuary and Junghang coast was a lack of high tide roosts. So when the water comes in, the birds were pushed up, and a lot of these sandy coasts and spits had been built on, even in an area which was as underdeveloped as Seocheon County. So out of the 7 major roosts which we mapped across this coastline, we found that 6 of them were only available for shorebirds to rest on for 54% of the high tides. So for 54% of the high tides, when the tide came up, birds had to go and find another option. And what were those options, I hear you ask, from the internet? Good question. That is a very good question. Well, here's some birds getting pushed up, closer and closer to the coastline. And as you can see, they're being condensed and they're vying for position. Our presence there has disturbed some, so they're off to find another roost, which is a common occurrence in highly populated areas. In a natural habitat, this is what you'd see. So this is in the Spencer Gulf in Australia. You'd see a nice peaceful flock of birds who, having seen that the tide has covered up their intertidal feeding area, they then sit at the top of the tide and wait it out, conserving energy as they do so. Similar to these curlew sandpipers you'll see in a second. The pink pelicans can continue feeding in the deeper water, but these short-legged wading birds sit up there preening together, resting, more eyes on potential predators and conserving energy. However, in Seocheon, this is one of the roosting opportunities, and many birds vying for one position. So these are eastern curlew and whimbrel, and they're all roosting here in a shrimp pond. And you can see that they're huddled together on the levee there with Terric sandpipers and greenshank, and they're vying for the position. Quite a bit of aggression there, waiting for the tide to recede so they can feed again, like this dumpling here. What other options are they taking? Well, as you can see here on the far right, you've got, there, yeah. You've got birds sitting up on the rocks, which abut a seawall. So that seawall was built on what would have been the upper intertidal area. And you can see above me, above my bald head here, you can see eastern curlews and greenshank slowly getting pushed there, longer-legged birds, so they can wait out the tide a little bit longer. But within minutes, they'll be pushed up onto those rocks, and further beyond that, they'll be pushed off those rocks by the tide as it hits that wall there. So where else are they going? Well, funnily enough, some of them are choosing to roost on the dredge pipes, the very infrastructure which had ruined their habitat in the past. Here we can see some sitting in the shipping channel which has been created in the Coombe estuary by the dredge pipes. Very unstable situation, almost zero thermoregulation quality, sitting on metal, and very prone to disturbance as passing ships use the shipping channel. And what if they can't find rocks, or they can't find a shrimp pond, or all these? Because remember we said there's up to 170,000 birds passing through these habitats. Well, the remainder of them take to the sky. And this is what we call an aerial roost. It's not a great name because roost suggests that they are resting, but in this case they're actually burning energy. And these birds are circling the skies looking for somewhere to land in flocks of, in this case, near 10,000 birds. And in many respects, they're like planes in a holding pattern.
Amazing.
So without any airstrip that's open for them to land on, they're circling and constantly burning fuel, which they actually require for their onward journey.
Pretty cool, eh, man?
So incredible waste of energy. So, what can we do? Well, traditionally around the world, shorebird conservation work on roosts has focused on building roosts, and that's involved terraforming, so making islands, making sand spits, and these have been very successful in many cases. Birds use them. They are prone to erosion. They do need ongoing management. They can be very costly. And in some cases, they can have detrimental impacts on the local ecology, that is, other intertidal communities. And in the case of Korea, this option wasn't available to us. We were only there for a short time, and in fact, some legislation that was created to improve shorebird habitat prevented anybody from building on the intertidal area. So although we wanted to build something for shorebirds, we weren't able to. So we had to think outside the box, and you guessed it, we decided rather than building on it, we'd float above it. And so again, I'll come back to one of my study sites. This is in the Spencer Gulf in South Australia, and these are redneck stints, sharp-tailed sandpipers and curlew sandpipers sitting at the high tide, floating on this enormous weed mat. And they're bobbing up and down on the tide there, quite rested, very peaceful, conserving energy, good thermoregulation. It's summer, spring, they've got their feet wet. They're able to maintain a positive energy balance by just resting at the tide, waiting for that tide to recede. But I couldn't very well propose that we take a hectare of eelgrass to the Yellow Sea and dump it there on the shoreline. So we had to get a bit more inventive. What artificial structures could we use? And I was racking my brain until I remembered a photo that a good friend of mine, Dan Weller, had taken near his holiday house in Merimbula. And here it is. an eastern curlew sitting on some aquaculture infrastructure. So in this case, an oyster bag. I didn't know what that was at the time, but I really know what they are now. So oyster bags are an Australian invention, and they're the new infrastructure used by many oyster farmers, but originated in Australia and in the Merimbula Lakes. So I got on the phone with some oyster farmers, found out who the manufacturer was, and it turned out that they were a small bunch of guys doing some big things out of Merimbula. One of them sent me this photo shortly after, and that looked pretty appetising. I thought, gee, I better get up there and do some research. So me and the wife got in the car, packed our bags, packed a slice of lemon and a nice dry Riesling, and we head up to do some research on oysters. For the shorebirds, though, for the shorebirds. And so when we got there, we met with these great guys who had changed the face of oyster farming, really, because they're doing this very low impact but high yield oyster farming, which just happens to be good for birds. So not only migratory shorebirds did we find there, but also terns, like these crested terns, all sorts of wading egrets and herons, like these great egrets here, and resident shorebirds, like this pied oyster catcher. And they were roosting all over the bags. And these bags have been there for a while. It started off as a small operation, only a few farmers using it. But now they've seen the benefits, and many other oyster leases have taken on this infrastructure. And as we speak, they're selling this technology overseas. What are the advantages for birds, though? So, as you can imagine, these things float, as opposed to the traditional infrastructure used for oyster farming, which is the rack and rail infrastructure, which is bolted into tidal and remains stable and gets covered and uncovered throughout the tide. This goes up and down with the tide. So it's available for birds to roost on throughout the whole tide cycle. This also has obvious advantages when we consider sea level rise. And it's very mobile, so it's anchored at each end, and then all those bags are attached to a storm line, and it can be moved. So you just remove the anchors and drag them elsewhere. Very adaptable. You can put it adjacent or next to the feeding areas, so to reduce birds' movements, requirement to move from feeding to roosting only has to be a short distance. And of course, this has advantages when you consider ecotourism, whether you want to set them up somewhere visible for people for training and engagement. They're very cheap, and the labour is very cheap to put them in. Only needs 2 or 3 people, one if you're very experienced, and they're low impact on the intertidal. So they sit above the water, and if anything, they create their own ecosystem. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. So we set about installing them, but we didn't go straight to Korea because that would be a bit of a big ask for us to say, look, we want to trial these floating roosts, which we don't know whether they're going to work, and we're just going to ship some stuff over. We'll see you there. No. So we worked with Melbourne Water and Parks Victoria to start with, and trialled some down on the western shoreline of Port Phillip Bay, WTP, the Western Treatment Plant. Some of you might know it. And so we put several in the coastal lagoon near the Spit, some on the actual bay, and some in some ponds, just to trial them in different environments. And as you can see, the buoys are attached to that long line, and they rise and lower with the tide, and birds are still available to feed around them as the tide rises and falls. We also trialled them in the Hunter, a little bit easier field work up there, and we trialled them. Both of these sites have altered coastlines, and we thought can't hurt to give shorebirds up there some supplementary sites to try, which are nearby to the known roost sites that we have already documented. So with these sites in, we put out each roost contains 120 bags, which are in 3 lines of 40 bags each, and are anchored at a 25 metre interval. And as you can see, we've got Emily Mowat there, a BirdLife hunter representative and oyster farmer, installing the roost there. And we almost got results straight away. So here we have the WTP roost, not the target species, but encouraging nonetheless. We had, as you can see in this one image here, several species of duck, pink-eared duck, chestnut teal, grey teal, hardhead, shell duck, egrets, all vying for position. If you do look very closely, you can see one of the target species, and that is a sharp-tailed sandpiper, which was the first migratory shorebird that we saw took to the roost. Following the sharpies came marsh sandpipers, greenshanks, redneck stints, curlew sandpipers, and a number of other shorebird species, but in relatively low densities. And this was because there were already existing natural roosts which these species would prefer to use, but it worked well as a trial concept. And what we also saw was that we had a number of other species using them, as I said. So white-faced heron here, we can see another sharp-tailed sandpiper in there amongst the ducks. And the coastal sites got a lot of terns. We had some interesting, a lot of sightings of fairy tern and little tern using the roosts at certain stages, which could have its own conservation impacts further down the line. But so with this in our pocket, we proposed the installation of roosts in the Kum estuary to the Koreans, and we started the process of deploying floating roosts in this highly impacted and endangered habitat. So we met with the government and we had consultations with several NGOs, and I wore a tie. It was all groundbreaking stuff. Here we're meeting with the local fishing village because we have to be on side with the local users of the coastline, and we'll just run through some of the actual installation here. We can see we're putting in the oyster shell. We don't need a full oyster here, we're not growing oysters, but the oyster shell works to not only weight the bag down, but also as a surface for the invertebrates to colonise. We had some interesting vehicles along the way. You could barely call it a truck. It took us five trips to get the 200 bags down to the site. Select the site pretty easily and head out with our screw anchors. Here's Bob Nichols, our resident expert, Kangaroo Island oyster farmer, who came with us to Korea and helped us with all the tech. Here's Dr. Young Min Moon, shorebird expert from Seoul, installing one of the screw anchors into the intertidal in a coastal area called Seoul Ri. And in many cases, it wasn't a matter of just hopping over the dune. We had to traverse these sea walls, so we had to get inventive. But once the bags are down on the intertidal, we simply clip them onto the storm line, which can take up to 10 tonne of weight. And we just waited. And as the tide came in, the birds amassed along the tide line, as you can see there. And tide floated the bags, and we were able to tow them out to their final destination. So I'll get rid of my fat head now. So here we are with the floating bags, towing them out to destination. And here you can see their final destination, and that seawall actually blocking what would have been a small tidal estuary. Just more images of me towing out bags just to show the boss that I actually break a sweat now and again. And Kangaroo Island oyster farmer Bob Nichols tying off the final bags before we jump out of the water. And there we have the final install. And if you look very closely on the far left, you can actually see the first couple of residents. As soon as we climbed up that seawall, two pteric sandpipers came and investigated the roost, and you can see them there bobbing up and down very happily only seconds after completion. As we continue to watch thousands more birds amassed along the tide line at Seocheon and came and investigated the roost. We installed remote cameras and were pleased to see that within weeks, hundreds of birds were taking to the roosts. Pleased as one bird, but it just shows the sheer desperation that these birds have in this very habitat and requirement for increased capacity of roosts. It wasn't just shorebirds that were using the roost at Seocheon. Here we can see some endangered black-faced spoonbills and Chinese egrets also using the roost. And here we can get an idea just of how many birds might compete for use of floating roosts. Again, a sign of the desperation that they have to find a roost at high tide. Around 500 birds, we estimate, were using the roosts at capacity on southern migration. And we were relieved to see that the resilience and the strength of these roosts held up against Korea's monsoons, which is not only good for our purposes, but great for the oyster industry if they want to be using them in more high-energy coastlines. Here we can see a grey heron just riding the waves. So, some pretty encouraging initial results. But beyond roosting, what else do we see? Well, as discussed earlier, the roosts might also provide a novel food source for birds, so at low tide and high tide. At low tide, they seem to concentrate invertebrates, and the communities which are growing within the bags provide feeding opportunities. The structures themselves provide a little bit of shelter from oncoming wind, so birds have been observed sitting along the leeway side of these bags and bunkering down, using them as shelter from the wind. Some birds remain sitting on them throughout the low tide, in fact. Here you can see a flock of pteric sandpipers and common sandpiper sitting out the low tide on the bags. And again, this might be tied to thermal properties. So this is one of the additional studies which we're doing with the floating roosts, is testing the thermal properties of the actual roosts compared to natural roosts. And we're using tiny little thermologgers. They're only about the size of a watch battery, and we attach them to the roost, but we also attach them to natural roosts, so we can compare the temperature variability. And initial results seem to indicate that the floating roosts, although temperature does vary, as we can expect within from day and night within a day as external temperatures vary, the insulative properties and the cooling properties of water that the roosts are on seem to make that a very small variation, whereas at the natural roosts they tend to vary a lot more with the ambient temperature. You can imagine the radiation off sand and rocks is a lot more variable. So there may be cases where these substitute additional roosts have better thermal properties, and birds may choose to use them in very hot conditions or very cool conditions. So, after a year of looking at these roosts and having them installed for over a year in Victorian habitats, we've got together a bit of a summary of what's been happening. Now, we can't be there monitoring the roosts every second of every day, but we do have a subset of data where we collect 10 seconds of footage every hour from each roost. And we've had a lot of people looking at this footage, and I think it's a meditative process going through all of these clips, sitting there for hours. But Oakley Germish, our graduate research scientist, has been painstakingly analysing them and documenting the birds that use these roosts. Now, I've got to stress at this point, we only advocate for these artificial floating roosts to be used in absolute last resort conditions. So when land managers are seeking to increase the capacity or ameliorate threats to a certain shorebird population, we encourage them to do everything that they can to either maintain existing roosts or optimise roosts that have somehow gone into disrepair. These are really focused to be used in areas like the Yellow Sea where there is no turning back. And in cases like the Coombe Estuary, we hope that they are able to be used, but eventually pulled out when we're able to restore natural roost conditions. So in that respect, these are only ever going to be temporary. And if they're used by birds for 1% of the complete tide cycle, then that's saving birds circling in the sky, burning excess energy for that, hour in a month. And we see that as a success. So if they remain empty for the entire time, that's great. Then we can perhaps assume that birds are finding sufficient roosts elsewhere. But I digress. Our results. So far across the sites, we've had 50 waterbird species using the roosts, 52 as of the other day when we had some Mars lapwings and blackwing stilts using them. And we've had a maximum, as you saw in that video, of around 500 birds, small waders, using a single roost at a single time. And so these are based on the standard setup which we've gone for, which is 120 bags. Of course, in year 2, we look forward to expanding and changing the setup. And we can always scale them up. They can always be bigger. So that's where we're going next. We're hoping to have a review of this first year data, meet with all our stakeholders. We've got some funding from the Corangamite CMA, who are helping us do a feasibility study on the western shoreline of Port Phillip Bay on how we might optimise the use of roosts, and they're aiding us in trialling the second phase of the roost to ultimately be deployed in the Yellow Sea. The Australian government has also chipped in to fund a technical guide to how we might assess the necessity for roost installation and where we can seek to put them. But one of the really important aspects which we're excited about is the phasing out of plastics. So at the moment we're using the commercially available black floats and plastic, high density plastic mesh bags, which are very durable and unlikely to contribute to any marine debris. They're used in really extreme conditions in the oyster industry, and we haven't lost any bags yet, touch wood, and don't expect to. But any plastic that you put in the ocean is susceptible to microabrasions as they rub against each other, and small contributions to microplastics into the ocean. So we don't want to be cutting our nose off to spite our face and contributing to microplastics. So we're working with RMIT to look into alternative materials. And these may include bioplastics, they might include traditional wares. The Koreans have been fishing, as we heard earlier, for decades, hundreds of years in these areas, and have used traditional handy wares like reed-based materials, kelp-based materials. Similarly, the Maoris and Indigenous Australians have been working the coasts for eons. So we seek to have a bit of a knowledge exchange as to how we can optimise those natural crafts and perhaps incorporate them into the roosts. So we're excited to move into phase 2, and hopefully we'll be able to find some funding to realise those within the next year. And hopefully COVID will take a hike and we'll be able to get them over to Korea and deploy them on site. In addition to the bird studies, obviously we're looking into the invertebrate study. So these have obvious advantages for the birds, and here we can see the oysters have been colonised by a plethora of little invertebrates. We've got amphipods and polychaetes and isopods, and you can see algae growing on these oyster shells, which can come from inside the roost. So we are slowly sifting through the masses of mud which come out of these things and are suspended in the intertidal. Here we see a sea anemone, which is attached to one of the oysters, and very common throughout the bags there again. Here's one of our big juicy polychaete worms, which would make absolutely fantastic turnstone fodder. A little amphipod wriggling around, delicacy amongst the sharp-tailed sandpiper community. And again, a mass of invertebrates, barnacles encrusting these things, amphipods swimming in there, using them for shelter, isopods crawling all over them. There we can see, just collected the other day. Fascinating communities which are beginning to grow within the roosts. In addition to the invertebrate life, there's obviously plant life which might seek to colonise these sites. So in the oyster industry, they try to discourage the growth of plants by flipping those bags. So here you can see those bags, but every few months the oysters get a bit of time out of the water and they flip the bags one on top of each other to stop the fouling of the oysters by invertebrates and by plants. We've left them. We're encouraging the growth of whatever wants to join our little party here. So as I said earlier, we've got in the Western treatment plant sites, we've got some Tecticornia, some salt marsh, which is growing out of one of the roosts. In the Hunter Estuary, not so advantageously, we've got little mangrove saplings, which are quite pervasive in the area, starting to grow on one of the roosts. So we've done a little bit of sample of flipping those over to try to discourage the growth of mangroves. So there's a lot of players, and I can only start to thank a handful of them because everybody's been so fantastic and encouraging around the Floating Roost project. And I've just been able to tap into a wealth of knowledge from shorebird experts to engineers and oyster farmers. So, but if I had to single out two people, these two absolute heroes and salt of the earth guys. Bob Nichols, as I've discussed, from Kangaroo Island, came with us to Korea. Also was a mastermind in engineering when we couldn't find the parts we needed, and we trawled through port supply stores here. You can see in Gunsan, and worked what we could. We found ourselves in automotive tips, pulling apart Isuzu trucks and jigging up the required infrastructure, and we got there, and it seems to have worked. The other man, our man on the ground, Youngmin Moon, Dr. Youngmin Moon there, you can see having a chuckle. Not only is he a phenomenal shorebird researcher, he's a hell of a guy. And has been our guide to soju, barbecue pork belly, namyang, which is my favourite cuisine, ginseng chicken, and also just an amazing fixer. Being able to find everybody that we could possibly need, tick every box, get every permit covered, and muster the support that we desperately needed to trial these roosts in Korea. So thank you, Young Min and Bob. And the wider cast, I can't get into it, but obviously we've got a lot of funding support from Woodside Energy, who enabled us through the larger Coombe Estuary Conserving Shorebirds of Coombe Estuary project to realise that this offshoot project, which has taken on legs of its own, and hopefully we'll be able to secure funding to continue the many prongs of this Floating Roost project, while continuing the work of conserving Coombe Estuary, which includes monitoring, providing a best practice management advice, and assisting with the World Heritage nomination for the west coast of Korea. You can find out more about that on coombe.birdlife.org.au. The oyster farmers, the BirdLife staff, the volunteers at Kooragang Park up in Hunter, The New South Wales Parks and Hunter LLS have been fantastic, and all the volunteers, of which there are very many in Korea, particularly Seocheon County and the Bird Park, I'd like to thank. So I think that's about it. Again, I'd just like to thank you for coming along and clicking to watch a little bit about the floating roosts. It's exciting to see it progress, and I could sit here and meditatively watch them non-stop. In fact, I did have a live feed for a while there, and my wife would find me waking up in the middle of the night watching ducks in lightning storms sitting up on the roost. But it's fascinating, so I'm lucky enough to call it a job. I finally would just like to stress again that this is just a trial to start with. We're seeing some encouraging results, but we're not at the stage where this can be deployed as a solution to a lack of roosts in any certain area. So please stay tuned if you're a land manager and you're interested in increasing your roost capacity, but please see it as a last resort. Do everything that you can to maintain and sustain the roosts that you have, to give the capacity to your current shorebird population. And then if you're at a loss and nothing is working, check back in with the floating roost program, and we can work through some feasibility studies as to how and when we might be able to deploy a final product for the trial. So thanks again, and stay tuned to BirdLife YouTube for more birding at home. Thanks.